Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to be joined by David Algar, resident carbonologist once again, to continue on that journey of carbonology to help you to be carbon neutral. Okay, so welcome back, David.
Thanks, Mel. Thanks for having me on again.
Cool. So far in the podcast series, we've covered defining your GHG emissions, quantification. So the last episode, we were talking all about the technical quantification of your carbon emissions. Then we mentioned about commitment and making that pledge to being carbon neutral. And now we're moving on to putting that into action, putting that carbon reduction plan into action. So hopefully we can get to see some really clear, tangible results on those carbon reductions. So really excited to cover this part with you because I think, some of our listeners will have already been on the ESOS journey, the Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme, where they have had to look at their carbon emissions and they have had to put forward some potential opportunity savings. That's one of the whole points of ESOS. But unfortunately, governments haven't actually mandated that those reductions should be implemented. And we all know that that's where the benefit to the environment comes from, because if we're not acting responsibly, doing the right thing, making those reductions, what's the point? So, the previous episodes, we've covered off what that number is. Now it's a case of getting down to focusing on how are we actually going to make a difference and reduce our GHG emissions. So for those of our listeners that have already got ISO 14001 and 50001 in place, it's really good news because you've already got mechanisms, you've got systems in place for operational controls to reduce your environmental footprint, and that can obviously include water, waste, etc., as well as energy and carbon emissions. But this is where we're getting really crystal clear on making reductions as far as carbon emissions are concerned. And this is where we're going to be doubling down on being absolutely laser focused on implementing those reductions. And I think this is where the credibility comes in. So rather than a company just paying a price for an offset, this is the difference. This is where you're actually getting serious about making those reductions. So if they're not doing that, then quite frankly, in my personal opinion, I think they're missing a trick. It's not just good for the environment, but it's good for business as well, both financially and operationally. So could you just walk us through this phase? So this is step 4, isn't it, in Carbonology? And just take us through the reduce phase, David.
Of course. So like you mentioned, it is a requirement of the standards to actually make those reductions. So this is a point in the Carbonology process where you begin implementing your carbon footprint management plan, or carbon reduction plan if you've called it that, and also communicating the implications of this to your staff and anyone external, if they need to get involved. To gauge how successful these initiatives actually are, you do need to find a way of monitoring your emissions. So basically a plan to collect data and continually report on emissions and activity use. So, whether that's a weekly or monthly basis or quarterly. So basically there's two main sides to this process and this step in the Carbonology methodology. Communicating the reduction plan to your staff to, make sure they, know what needs doing, and monitoring on its effectiveness essentially.
Okay, great. So just to highlight that then, so there are two main sides to this process, you said. One is communicating the reduction plan to your staff, which is so important. And from our experience of implementing management systems, there isn't much point in having a management system if you're not going to communicate it to employees. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about, how you go about doing that. And then the second one was monitoring its effectiveness. Yeah, so you don't really know if you are hitting your targets, objectives, unless you've got some kind of key performance indicator, some kind of targets on that you can actually monitor again. So let's dive into that then, David.
Yeah, so like I mentioned a moment ago, the standard requires you to make reductions, whether they're absolute or intensity-based reductions, between reporting periods. So the way this is actually achieved is through that carbon footprint management plan, or carbon reduction plan as we've called it. But staff won't know how or why to contribute to this plan if they don't actually know it exists in the first place. Hence why you need that communications plan to back it up. what this means is, staff need to be aware of the specific changes that are going to come into play and how this will affect their roles and how they can contribute to making reductions. And, at the end of the day, they need to know the reason why the business has chosen to aim for this.
So how do you go about managing those communications?
So ideally, communications should be regular, and they really should provide staff with enough detail and context to basically empower them to contribute to reductions. Of course, in the real world, in talking about running a real business, not everyone will like these changes, especially if they're big changes. So it's really important to communicate the reasons why they're occurring to staff and the potential benefits that they will actually gain for them, relative to their job role.
So I know in terms of experience with other ISO standards, I think it's really key to empower employees to take responsibility for these changes. And a key part of that is getting them involved on this journey at a very early stage. And in some respects, trying to make it as fun as possible. And I know that might sound a bit weird in a business sense, but it works. If you can almost have competitions or initiatives, being able to communicate that. And a lot of companies now have almost like social media channels internally so that people can talk about things. So it's about creating a bit of a buzz and an atmosphere, isn't it, about acting responsibly and doing the right thing and making sure that they're all sharing the vision, that they're all on this journey together. So, could you give me some kind of more practical examples though, like from an operational perspective now, on how it could be beneficial for an organisation?
Yes, a common sort of practical example from an operational perspective, a lot of businesses are thinking about or implementing at the moment are electric vehicles. So I'm sure that most staff would actually gladly switch to an electric vehicle, but it's not really a practical option for everyone. But this could be a good opportunity to actually support staff's transition towards an electric vehicle in some ways. Perhaps through more charging points at your office to get rid of that range anxiety, or potentially some sort of financial incentive to allow them to make that switch. This could work in your favour, particularly if you end up having to pay lower expenses for business mileage. Depending on where you get your energy from and how much the price of petrol at the specific time, it could result in actually some savings.
Yeah. So the other thing that you mentioned was about the monitoring and measurement. So could you just drill down into that in a bit more detail?
Yes, so the other side of this, as I mentioned a minute ago, is actually monitoring the success and the progress of these initiatives. Depending on the data you're collecting and the actual structure of your organisation, it would be ideal if you could collect the data at regular intervals and plug this into a nice big spreadsheet. That will allow you to see trends across the year and between years. You'll be able to compare March this year with March last year and see how you're getting on. The benefit of this is you can see the success, or if things aren't going so well, the actual failure or inefficiencies of any initiatives you've got in real time. Again, in practical terms, I think I went on a rant about this in the last episode, is taking meter readings at regular intervals, because this actually allows you to compare trends regularly instead of having random readings across the year. And again, collecting mileage data at regular intervals so you can actually see the differences there, or tracking potentially freight movements. And if necessary, this means you'll be able to take preventative action. Say if, for instance, you see a massive spike in electricity or water or waste at a certain site, you'll be able to see that quickly instead of waiting until the end of the year and do something about it. But, on a more positive note, this is a really good opportunity to recognise the success of specific sites or specific individuals, or, potentially sustainability groups. Staff are a resource from a business perspective. So if an individual or group of individuals comes up with a really good and successful idea that leads to reductions, I personally think they should be rewarded. And this potentially could incentivize others to follow suit and ultimately make your life easier if more people are involved.
So, we're talking about the internal communications here and getting the job done as far as reductions are concerned. But I think it's just as important to communicate that commitment externally as well. And, there isn't any harm in reporting on your progress as an organisation. And especially if you've got key stakeholders that are expecting you to be acting responsibly and doing the right thing. I think the key difference here is if you're actually communicating that progress, they can see how serious you actually are about reducing your carbon footprint, and they can see you on that journey, on that pathway, which again, it's just demonstrating your credibility and the confidence that you have in your carbon reduction plan and your sustainability strategy. So I think it's really great to share that communication not only internally, but I could see the benefits externally. And that could help to win more business. If you can make it really transparent. Again, going back to the principle that you mentioned in one of the previous episodes, David, it's a great resource for communications, and for your communications team, it's providing some up-to-date information on progress. And of course, that can then be consolidated into management reports, can't it? If an organisation needs to report to the board or other key stakeholders on the carbon footprint, if they've got that data at their fingertips on either, weekly, daily, monthly basis, it makes it much easier to be able to report on it as well. And I think, when it comes to things like ESOS and other mandatory reporting, again, it's not like you're starting from scratch. You've already got the information there at your fingertips that you can communicate to the regulatory bodies as well. Okay, so just to wrap up on this then, so at this stage that we're at, stage 4 on reduce, from a point of somebody who might be a little bit sceptical and might think, well, we'll just identify our carbon footprint and offset it, and that's it. We don't have time, we don't want to bother with the reduction. What would you say is the main outcome and deliverable here at this stage that could kind of sway that decision?
So you need to make those reductions, and like I said, to do this you need a plan. The two main outcomes from this step that basically support that plan and enable you to make those reductions are, again, another plan, the communications plan, both internally and externally, to basically inform staff about what's going to happen and empower them to contribute in their own way. And then the other side of that being a system to actually continually monitor on emissions, so you can see those trends, make changes, recognize its success. I mean, you could look at potentially a pilot scheme in one area, monitor its success and apply it to another area and see how it works out. But essentially, these undertakings allow you to make those reductions and identify where they're happening in real time. It's also a really good opportunity, if you haven't already done so within your organisation, to form a sustainability group, which I know a lot of companies are doing at the moment. This could be a handful of staff with an interest in environmental matters, from various areas of your business. I find that having a sustainability group with members of staff from across the business, it may help take a more holistic approach when it comes to looking at the actual practicalities of emission reductions initiatives, because ultimately they'll have, everyone will have different experiences of the operations of the business.
Yeah, and I think, for some organisations that are already certified to 14001, the environmental standard, or ISO 50001, it's a good opportunity to bring those additional people into the fold and to have different sustainability champions as well across an organisation to support you and help you to drive that agenda forward on carbon neutrality and acting responsibly and doing the right thing. Great. Well, thanks very much for answering all my questions on that, David. And so if our listeners have enjoyed listening to this podcast, and if you found that it was useful for you, we'd really love to hear from you. Your reviews really do count. Not only for us, because that helps to kind of share, the podcast that we're recording for you, but also it attracts other listeners as well to subscribe to the ISO show, so that more people get to hear about the fantastic work that surrounds the ISO standards, and to hear about other company success stories, as well as some of the technical aspects like we're covering today on how to become carbon neutral through implementing ISO 14064, the carbon verification standard, and PAS 2060. So yeah, we would love to hear from you. So if you'd like to leave a review on the player, that you're listening to, we would really, really appreciate that. Okay, so on that note, I'd just like to say thanks very much once again, David, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.